Okay, good evening, and thank you for joining me and Golders Green Synagogue for this first ever Zoom End of Tisha B'Av program. In most previous years, my big Tisha B'Av lecture has been about some experience of persecution. We've looked at pogroms, crusades, periodically the Holocaust, and various other horrible moments in Jewish history, including blood libels, the Black Death, for which the Jews were often blamed, and many other things over the years. This year I decided, instead of looking at anti-Semitic incidents, to look at anti-Semitic people. Particularly, many of you will know that I have a certain love for 19th century literature. And I've decided this year to examine, in comparison, Dostoevsky, his attitude towards the Jews, and Dickens, and compare them. When I began preparing, I thought I'd made an error, and I decided there was more than enough material just for Dickens, but I decided actually that the comparison may be interesting. As I mentioned just before some of you joined, the source sheets will be displayed, and they are also available from a link that's in the chat. If people can't see that, then, well, I'll put it up once more, but I think that, just in case you can't see it, there we go. Now, by way of introduction, I thought that the focus on individuals and their development, actually, because they're both really about development, might be of interest. I also mentioned earlier that although I normally speak for around an hour and a half most years in Tisha B'Av, that's a long time for everyone to stare at a screen. So I may make it a little shorter. I don't usually have any complaints when I do that, so I assume there won't be any this evening. For time being, I'm going to keep people on Zoom, on mute, but you are able to unmute yourself if you have something very pressing to say or would like to interject or complain. Now I'm going to give me a moment to get the sources on the screen, and then we'll begin. And here we go. So I hope you can all see that. So as I've done in previous years, we have here just some photos to start with. A classic pose of Dickens, a picture of Dostoevsky. That's a painting, which is why it's coloured, whereas the photograph is, the Dickens is a photograph. And then here, two others. One is Ron Moody in his role as Fagin, one with which you're all familiar. Astonishingly, that appeared 52 years ago. That rendition of Oliver Twist. And then someone of whom you may not have heard, but is going to be central in our study of Dickens, someone called Eliza Davis, whom we'll come across a little later. So these are just to give us a bit of an entree, and I'm now ready to look at the sources. So I think the background is that we are aware that in Europe and in the UK as well, there is and has been a kind of residual cultural, societal anti-Semitism, which is articulated in all kinds of forms, not least in art and particularly in literature. And those anti-Semitic tropes appear in the writings of many authors, and even the great George Eliot, who is held to be the great Philo-Semite, to whom I've spoken before, and many of you would have read Daniel Deronda. I recently read Middlemarch and Silas Marner. One has to have something to do during the lockdown, and they are the standard, uncomplimentary, low-level anti-Semitic tropes appear there, notwithstanding the fact that she changed her tune towards the end of her life. These tropes appear in all kinds of literature and have continued to do so. Now, the best way to familiarize ourselves is to look at the sources. This source pack has nearly 20 pages, and it's not my intention to read all of it. And it's, as in previous years, perhaps useful to take home and have a look at. And as I said, you can download it from my website if you don't have access to it now, so for future consumption. But the best way is I'm going to divide it into sections. First, we're going to look at Dostoevsky. I will do a little bit of compare and contrast, but since I call it Dostoevsky, Dickens and the Jews, Dostoevsky will come first. So Dostoevsky's works, which have anti-Jewish tropes, are mostly letters rather than his novels. He does have a number of Jewish characters and uncomplimentary references to Jews, and these are by no means exhausted. Both Dostoevsky and Dickens were extremely prolific writers, and it would take dozens and dozens of pages to probably produce an incomplete reference to Jews. I've tried to do these somewhat in chronological order. So here we have, and I'm not planning to read all of it, but I'm just going to pick out a few sources. The rest you can look at yourself. Here's a poem from 1854, which you can see from his dates is kind of at the height of his powers in his 30s, and he's writing well there, although some of his greater works come later. Here is a poem which you can see repeats the trope of the Jews crucifying Christ. Shame, extinguishers of the divine light. It's a pretty bad place to start. Now, in the 1860s, Dostoevsky edited a number of journals, one of them called Time. And here you see a slightly more moderate approach to Judaism. The government in the early 1860s in Russia allowed Jewish graduates to enter government service, and there was a harsh attack from conservatives, to which Dostoevsky's Time magazine responded: if there is within Judaism something inherently harmful to Christianity, then the preservation of Christian society from this evil can only be found within its faith. Day seeks another safeguard, would like to see it in the law. Would Day have us believe, I think that's another journal, that we would be acting quite logically, quite honestly, unhypocritically if we burned and hanged the Jews? For surely we would have very sound grounds for doing so. I mean, it's a bit of a backhanded approach. We would say, these Jews crucified him whom we recognize as God. It's not this spirit, it seems to us, that inspired the teachings of him in whose name Day is apparently speaking, meaning that may be the case. It may well be, as he said in this poem in 1854, that we are Christ killers. However, that's not the spirit of Jesus to go in that direction. The teachings of peace, love, and concord should have prompted other thoughts and other words. However, such complementary or partially complementary references are few and far between. One of his most well-known references to Jews in Notes from the Dead House, or Notes from the House of the Dead, which is somewhat autobiographical. Dostoevsky was sentenced to hard labor, originally to execution for sedition. His sentence was commuted, and he said several years of hard service, very far in the modern equivalent of the gulags. And in the Notes in the Dead House, he has a character called Isai Formich. And this is a Jewish character. And you can see, muttering some strange, mysterious words, he began enveloping himself in his chasuble. That's a tallis, in other words. On both arms, he fastened maniples. This obviously is to fill in on his forehead a little wooden box of sorts, secured by a band, so that it looked like some ridiculous horns sprouting out of his forehead. Then the prayer began. He recited in a sing-song voice, wailing, sputtering, pirouetting, gesticulating wildly and absurdly. All this was, of course, prescribed by the ritual. There was nothing absurd or strange about it. What was absurd was the way in which Isai Formich seemed to pose before us and make a display of his ritual. That's quite a well-known reference. And then these are various other references, which I'm not going to read. There isn't time to read all the texts in the same work, which sees Jews as mean, cheats, and Christ killers. The same thing again. And the references from Dead House end there. We move to the Gambler, and as I said, these are much the same: gold, money, similar, the usual anti-Semitic tropes. In The Possessed, or The Devils, which is one of his later works, Dostoevsky wrote 5 novels, of which The Possessed or Devils is one. And you see here the beginning of something which becomes for him, it seems, an obsession, which is that there is a chosen people. There is a people who bears the mission of God. And by the time he gets to this stage in his life, he believes the Jews have been replaced not just by Orthodox Christianity, of which he was a very strong and fervent adherent, but also specifically by the Russians. And he sees the Russian people as the replacement for the Jews in the service of God. And although I'm not going to read this piece, you can see at the end, a people that loses that faith is no longer a people. This is attacking the Jews. But the truth is one, and therefore can only be one people from among all the peoples that possesses the true God, even though the other peoples have their own gods and great ones at that. The sole God-bearing people is the Russian people. And we're going to see that when we have to do some analysis a little further on, we're going to see this reappearing. And The Diary of a Writer was a work that came out as a journal. And you can see here, we're now in June 1876. We're only about 6 years or so from his death. And he now attacks what he describes the Yids becoming landowners, exhausting the soil of Russia, plundering, robbing the peasants, robbing the Russians of their rights. What has civic equality got to do with it? When what you have here, first and foremost, flagrant Talmudic status in statute. Not only the exhaustion of the soil, but also the impending exhaustion of our peasant, i.e. a kind of another classic anti-Semitic trope, the Jew as homeless immigrant who comes to try to take over the jobs and resources of the locals. These things all fit together. What is, however, even more extreme is what we see in his letters, which you can see here are dated from 1876. This is in the last phase of his writings, particularly culminating in a letter to someone called Yulia Abaza, who was another journalist, at the bottom of the page. And we can see repetitions of the same tropes. Jews purchase the capital and they suck the energy out of the country. If the Russians don't annex the Crimea, the Jews will destroy the region. The next one, February 1878, again just 4 or 5 years or so before he dies, attacking the Jews in a certain province, and the conspiracy theory around how Jews are taking over everything. They run the literary market. As he gets older, he sees Jewish influence in land, he sees it in war, he sees it in property, he sees it in literature, and so on. And we see here, and I think critically worth reading, in August 1879, a letter which betrays a certain influence that I'm going to focus on as we move forward, a letter that he wrote to Pobedonstev. Now, Pobedonstev, Konstantin Pobedonstev, was a Russian, he was a jurist, statesman, extremely influential in the 1870s, 80s, and a little later on the Tsars, and helped to formulate their policy, and particularly the anti-Semitic policies that pertained in the Pales of Settlement that encouraged so many Jews to flee and go to America and to flee to Western Europe. He was the archetypal Russian autocratic anti-Semite who was part of the establishment anti-Semitism, and whom someone, Dostoevsky, becomes increasingly close towards the end of his life and is increasingly influenced by and wishes to impress. And here is part of his correspondence with Pobedonstev. This present visit is the worst ever. The riffraff from all Europe is here in the thousands, not many Russians, and they're all on the unfamiliar sort from the Russian borderlands. It's worth noting here that many writers, Dostoevsky and Dickens included, have an antipathy to other. So the Jews are the archetypal other, but he doesn't like other people who are like him either. I mark you, literally half of them are Yids. During my stopover in Berlin, I mentioned to Pustikovna that in my view, Germany, Berlin anyway, was becoming Judaized. And now here I read in Moscow Record an extract from a pamphlet that's just appeared in Germany, was becoming terribly Judaized. In Germany. Come now, where's the Jew here? It's one Yid's answer to a German who dared to write that Germany is becoming Judaized in all respects, and so on and so forth. Conspiracy theories about Jews taking over everything. The percentage of Jews in Germany was very small. Nonetheless, they see influence everywhere. Europe is about to fall. It's the Jews doing. Are the railways, the Jews taking over our economic power? But this letter here is widely quoted. This one to Yulia Abaza: the thought that breeds of people who received an initial idea from their forefathers and obeyed it perfectly over several generations must degenerate into something separate from humankind as a whole, and even in the best conditions, into something hostile to humankind as a whole. This thought is truthful and deep. Thus, for example, the Jews from Abraham until our days when they turned into Yids. Christ, apart from his other meaning, was the amendment to this idea. idea, broadening to pan-humanity, i.e. we are narrow particularists and the Christians are very broad-minded universalists. However, Jews did not want the amendment. They persisted with their previous tunnel vision, thereby instead of turning to pan-humanity, turned into the enemies of humankind, denying the existence of everybody apart from themselves. And indeed now they remain carriers of the Antichrist and of course will prevail for a period of time. It is so obvious that it is impossible to disagree. They are breaking through, they are coming, they have filled the whole of Europe, everything selfish, everything hostile to humankind, all vile passions of humankind, all this is on their side. How can they not prevail in the destruction of the world? So you see the most extreme concatenation of the Christian themes, the themes of the conspiracy themes of taking over every aspect of humanity, perverting humanity. And you see, by the time he gets to this stage, just a couple more things. We're now at the end of his life, and we ended our citations of Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov, which, by the way, remains one of my very favorite books. I think it's one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest novel ever written. And he has a number of uncomplimentary references here. Blood libel. You see in one book I have read about some trial someplace and how he's got hold of a 4-year-old boy and cut off all the fingers of both hands and then fastened the wall, hammered nails into him and crucified him. And afterward he told the court that the child had died quickly in a matter of 4 hours. That's fast, all right. He said the child moaned and moaned all the while and he stood there feasting his eyes upon him. That's great, great. Yes, great. I sometimes imagined that it was I who crucified him. He would hang there moaning and I would sit opposite him eating pineapple compote. I adore pineapple compote. How about you? This matter-of-fact reference to the kind of murder of a Christian child. This is classic blood libel conspiracy theory. And finally, the reference where you see that he now buys into the kind of anti-Semitic tropes of wealthy and powerful Jews taking over Europe. In his notebook entry, a few months before he died, under Yid, the Bismarcks, the Beaconsfields, and you'll recognize that reference, that's a reference to Disraeli, who took the name Earl Beaconsfield when he was a noble, the French Republic, Gambetta. The power they all represent is nothing but an illusion, and increasingly so with each passing day. Their master, the master of all, the master of Europe is the Yid and his bank. And this, of course, is a reference to Rothschild, the classic Rothschild conspiracy theory, which is mentioned here and mentioned elsewhere, I believe, explicitly. The Jew comes to bring socialism to uproot Christianity, to destroy civilization, and when anarchy remains, the Jew will step in and take over everything, controlling the riches of Europe. The bank will still be there. The Antichrist will come and stand above the anarchy. The Jew is the Antichrist. So what we see here is, apart from classic, deeply unpleasant and upsetting anti-Semitic tropes, an intensification as Dostoevsky gets older, as his writing becomes more mature. He refers to conspiracy theories, Jews taking over the world, blood libels, Rothschild, banking, taking over everything. This is how Dostoevsky enters life in this cul-de-sac of what we would describe as kind of fairly extreme anti-Semitic tropes. And it's very clear that I deliberately put them in chronological order so you can see the development from what I would describe as modest, perhaps societally normal anti-Semitic references to Jews to full-scale hatred, extreme anti-Jewish tropes. Now, a little bit of analysis here. I have some references from a few papers and books. Again, I'm not going to read all of it. We are still only on page 5. And so I'm going to make reference to them. And again, you can read them all at home. Here is a journal article by someone called Rosenfeld about Isai Fomich, whom we met in the House of the Dead. His surname, which I hadn't yet told you, is Bumstein. I'm not sure whether it's said like that, and it probably doesn't have quite the same meaning in Russian, but it's a kind of joke Jewish name. And as Rosenfeld says, this is his first attempt at depicting a Jewish character in fiction. Although drawn from real life, because he does appear to have encountered a Jewish fellow convict during his period of isolation and estrangement, nonetheless, it's a stereotypical depiction, and it's very similar to the literature that Dostoevsky will have seen and have been influenced by, and Russian writers' superficial contacts with Jews in the Pale of Settlement, which is in Western Russia. And Then he picks up and says that later there are only very minor references to Jewish characters in his novels, but it's in his journalism in the 1870s, of which we've seen a number of examples, where Jews start to appear as taking over Christian civilization, replacing Christianity, and so on, as he says at the end, fulminating against the Judaism of Christian European civilization, but contempt, if not hostility, as well in the later fiction, as we saw the specific reference to blood libel in the brothers Karamazov, which is, in my view, his greatest novel, but also his last major work. A little more there from Rosenfeld, which I'm going to omit. Now, there is an entire work originally written in French by someone called David Goldstein, called Dostoevsky and the Jews, a 250-page study of this. And I have a number of excerpts from this. And this is, I think, where we find it gets interesting. And I'd perhaps already been able to identify this trajectory from the excerpts we've seen. An indisputable fact in the biography of Dostoevsky in the last decade of his life is that he chose to identify himself more and more closely with the most conservative elements in the higher spheres of government, with those who saw but one answer to the growing political, social, and economic unrest, the return to fundamentals, the reaffirmation of Russian life of the principles of autocracy and orthodoxy, the appeal to the traditional virtues of the Russian people, their patriotism and self-abnegation. These views Dostoevsky ardently shared, and he became a vehement advocate of them. And here, what I'd already seen, this new venture in many ways proved to be a turning point in Dostoevsky's life. It marked the beginning of his lasting friendship with Dostoevsky, hard word to say, Dostoevsky, a member of the influential Council of State, an intimate of the imperial family, future procurator of the Holy Synod, an advisor to Alexander III throughout his reign. And we see that he became a friend, a confidant, a correspondent, and he became highly influenced in the last decade or so of his life by the extreme political anti-Semitism with which Dostoevsky was trying to influence the Tsar. Again, he points out that he was completely indifferent or whether these were just or not. He was irrelevant. This was irrelevant. It did not deter him from keeping on alert of the material. Of course, he would constantly, as all anti-Semites do, seek evidence to support his thesis while ignoring the vast body that would not. And there are a number of important references here. And I'm going to move past this. Goldstein is, I've read parts of it. It's quite a dull read, but it is viewed as the most important work on this subject. A more varied work is by Elena Katz, which is studies Russian literature in that period and focuses on a number of authors, of which Dostoevsky is one. She debates about 70 pages and part of the introduction to Dostoevsky. And she makes an interesting observation that initially anti-Semitism was foreign import to Russia. This, I don't know if this is true. She claims and tries to evidence that it was originated in Germany. We know the origin of the term anti-Semitism. It's a sanitized phase of Jew hatred. This is something that we've studied before by Wilhelm Marr, a German self-declared anti-Semite. And he talks about, she talks about, here, the influence of these radical ideas in the Bismarck era that eventually led to the Nazis' final solution. But she looks at different sorts of anti-Jewish prejudices. And she says here, evident at the bottom of the page, Russian prejudice against the Jews frequently virulent, but not based on racist thinking to any great extent until the end of the 19th century. Although we do not see that. We see in Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky sees the Jews in religious terms a threat to Christianity, an existential threat to the objectives of Christianity. And she goes on to explain that he said Dostoevsky is characterized by the Jew as other, but eventually changes his view. Apologies, there are a few typos, so it's difficult to produce this volume of text at the odd time. It's of course 1870 to 1881. And during this last decade, he becomes nationalistic, zealous, and he becomes a zealot, military anti-Semitic, and so on. And the same kind of stuff there that Goldstein says. In fact, she quotes Goldstein. In the end of that paragraph, his life experience of religious faith contributed, so he becomes more fanatically devoted to the conservative wing of the Russian Orthodox Church, and that development is reflected in his journalistic activities. The belief that Orthodoxy is the only true religion, and then in the following paragraph, a new law, he refers to that, as we saw that there was an authorization published that allowed Jews to join government if they were university graduates. And we saw a little bit of that correspondence. And Time, that journal, offers a sort of very guarded response. They're still Christ killers, but maybe the best way to handle them is not to try to kill them. Again, she makes reference to the blood substance of the Russian soul, the threat, Rothschild, and the things we've seen already about the fear of Judaizing Europe and the need to resist this, because ultimately the Jews will pick up from the chaos and take over the world. These classic pre-protocols kind of tropes that find, if you like, a formulation in the fake protocols of the Elders of Zion, which are published after this. Again, a little more there, which I'm proposing to leave out already on 8:30. I want to just look at the last paragraph, which actually comes from a section near the end of Katz. A great deal has been written on this relationship between the writer's mental state and his politics and aesthetics. Dostoevsky's deteriorating health during the final decade of his life, something went wrong there with the scanning, but you'll forgive me, his natural hypersensitivity, intensified by increasing attacks of epileptic seizures, permits discussions of his work in terms of his personal psychopathology. So James Rice highlights Dostoevsky's notorious extremes of orthodox patriotism and anti-Semitism during his last years, which in his view support the common psychiatric opinion there is frequent morbid religiosity in epileptics tending towards being. Dostoevsky's escalating suspiciousness and his perception of the world as a kingdom of everyone that is ill will towards everybody else were caused by a typical paranoid symptom, namely that by the mid-70s, like the 1870s, the world had become fundamentally Judaized for him. For Dostoevsky, the Jewish question, even in his non-fictional works, was indisputably complex for a number of reasons, medical, ideological, and religious, to mention just a few. So this somewhat moderates, and that's why I stuck it at the end. We see an increasing fanaticism of his religious identity, of his political associations, and I think of his acceptability, having recovered from his original Estrada venture, as he was sentenced to death. And you can read, I think it's in The Devils of the Possessed, his autobiographical account of believing he was going to be executed by a firing squad, a sentence that was commuted at the last second. But we also see in this that his state of health, today we might describe it as some kind of mental breakdown, a mental health issue, brought on perhaps by epilepsy, and the kind of extreme fervor, bigotry may be explained, according to Katz, partly in terms of growing, except in conservative women's society, growing relationship with Pobedonostsev and other and important aristocratic anti-Semites, but also possibly in terms of some kind of psychopathology, that he is developing paranoia, which may well have been evident in other areas of his life. So what we start with is Dostoevsky, a man who begins apparently with what we would describe as societal, circumstantial, contextual anti-Semitism, and moves towards becoming an existential Jew hater, whose writings, association, whether they are generated by changing ideology or by his state of mind, move towards a full-on hatred narrative that would do the Nazis proud, in which the Jew are the enemy of everyone, taking over the world, taking over society, and which the Rothschilds and the Disraelis are the enemy of the world, are going to replace and destroy the only true faith. And that role anyway is occupied by the Russians from the perspective of this extreme version of Russian orthodoxy. And so there we see Dostoevsky starting in one place and moving in a trajectory under a set of particular influences. Now, in contrast, I'm going to do the same now with some of the works of Dickens. So, of course, you'll see from my photograph of Ron Moody playing Fagin in Oliver, the 68 adaptation of Oliver Twist, that Oliver Twist is going to be a primary study here in the figure of Fagin. Now, it is not my intention to read every reference to Jews in Oliver Twist, because that would take till next Tisha B'Av, because there are hundreds of them. What is interesting is the caricature Jew that Fagin is, the way in which he is described, the way he is portrayed, but most importantly, the constant reference in the first part of the work to him as the Jew, not by name, or sometimes you can see here, it's called Fagin. And these are selections. That's Oliver Twist, as many of Dickens' works, in fact, many authors' works of that time, was published in installments, sometimes over a couple of years. And they were only published as full works of literature once the final installment had been published. And Fagin is the archetype Jew in the writings of the early writings, let's say, of Dickens. We have this man, he's a shriveled Jew whose villainous looking and repulsive face. And here we know we are not reliant on the translator. Of course, it went without saying that all of the excerpts from Dostoevsky's writings have been translated from Russian, and we are therefore dependent on the translator. Here, of course, this is the original, whose villainous looking and repulsive face was obscured by a quantity of matted red hair. He was dressed in a greasy flannel gown. Now, Dickens is renowned for these sorts of very, very graphic and engaging portrayals, with his throat bare, and seemed to be dividing his attention between the frying pan and the clothes horse, over which a great number of silk handkerchiefs were hanging. And so it goes on. These all crowded, these boys, about their associate as he whispered a few words to the Jew, and then turned round and grinned at Oliver. So did the Jew himself, toasting fork in hand. This is him, Fagin, said Jack Dawkins, my friend Oliver Twist, the Jew. And the reason I'm bringing this now is not so that we should read through it in a torturous way. That's not the intention. But to see how he is repeatedly referred to, not by name and not just by the uncomplimentary description. Of course, he's a thief who in the original, not in the film, will die for his crimes, who not only is a thief, but has an organized crime network around him. Apart from that, portrays the Jew as a thief. Apart from using that as the kind of portrayal, that's how he sees the Jew and the very uncomplimentary print, is the fact that he constantly refers to him as the Jew, Oliver ate his share, and the Jew. Next page. Oliver was precisely in this condition. He saw the Jew. And as I said, the Jew, I just give you some sense of the hundreds, and there are hundreds of times in which he refers to him as the Jew, which means he's emphasizing all the time, not that he's a thief, not that he's ugly or unpleasant or manipulative, but that he's a Jew. This is a constant trip. He's the Jew all the way through this text. I mean, he's referred to occasionally as Fagin, but he's referred to repeatedly as the Jew, as you can see. Even these last few lines, said the Jew, turning rather pale. They're mine, these pretty things that refer to just above. Oliver, my little property. Again, Oliver thought the old gentleman must be decided misers, lives in a dirty place with so many watches. I mean, he seems to be quite wealthy, but he lives in the hovel. He only cast a deferential look at the Jew and asked if he might get up. And so it goes on. Now, just to look at a few other references, there are many other references to Jews or to Jewish characters in the works of Dickens. Here we see an excerpt from the Old Curiosity Shop. Again, I have done them mostly chronologically. This brass was an attorney of no very good reputation from Bevis Marks in the City of London, obviously a reference to the Jewish community. He was a tall, meagre man with a nose like a wen, a protruding forehead, retreating eyes, and a hair of deep red. They note the deep red hair. Whether all the Jews he met had red hair, I'm not really sure. We have another Jew with red hair. Again, an uncomplimentary portrayal of this Jewish conniving attorney. Hard Times, 1854. Again, references to Hebrew monetary transactions, Great Expectations, and so on. I mean, this is one you need to be able to. You need a bit of an actor to read this. But we have a Hebrew Lazarus, which is of course Avraham Lazarus or Lazarus. But the person speaking has a lisp. Abraham Lazarus, as you can see, again, uncomplimentary portrayal, although it is nowhere near as uncomplimentary as Fagin. No, reminder, he's called the excitable Jew, and this is this Abraham Lazarus. Again, not planning to read it in any detail, because we're going to move on to the analysis shortly. Now, sketches by Boz, a little later, another Jewish reference. Again, not quite as bad, but they are again, we see despised red-head and red-whiskered Jews who forcibly haul you into their squalid houses and thrust you into a suit of clothes whether you will or not. We detest, i.e. they kind of force their sales upon you, their salesmen, hawkers, and so on. And they go together, as you can see at the top, Jews with nondescripts. However, in the later sections of Oliver Twist, and we're going to explore what happens very shortly, although there are references to Fagin as the Jew, he's referred to much more frequently as Fagin and in much less uncomplimentary terms. Clearly, Dickens cannot change the character. He is a thief. He is, if you like, he is the king of the thieves. And he is still going to meet a very sticky end, and he's still, as he were, at least one of the villains of the story. And you can see, he still refers to him as the Jew, but it is much less uncomplimentary, and he's far more frequently referred to by name. The girl drew closer to the table, middle of the page, and glancing at Monks with an air of careless levity, withdrew her eyes, but as he turned towards Fagin, she stole another look. You don't immediately get that jolt when he's being described as he's Fagin. Any news, inquired Fagin. The stranger was Mr. Fagin. A pleasant night, sir, but called for the time. It said Fagin. We have not so much done that, replied Fagin. It's a completely different tone. The character is no more lovable, but the descriptions are very much more complimentary, or let's say less uncomplimentary. And here are some more excerpts. Again, they're really for your study, but repeated references to Fagin and very, very few references. There is one in the middle of the page, which I'll highlight for you, so I can use my magic pencil. Here we go. You can see that's a reference to the Jew, but there are many references to Fagin. He's referred to Fagin, he's referred to the Jew there, but Fagin repeatedly. And there is more sympathy for the character in the second part of the book. Now, more than sufficient of this. A couple more references, and we've done quite well on page 13 of the sources now. By the time we get to 1851, in a work which I haven't read called A Child's History of England, we have the following. To dismiss the sad subject of the Jews of the present, I'm sorry to add that in this reign, they were most unmercifully pillaged. This is talking about medieval period, I think the time of King Richard. They were hanged in great numbers on accusations of having clipped the king's coin, which all kinds of people had done. They were heavily taxed. They were disgracefully badged. They were badged, that means they had to wear a badge. They were on one day, 13 years after the coronation, taken up with their wives and children and thrown into beastly prisons until they purchased their release by paying to the king £12,000. Finally, every kind of property belonging to them was seized by the king, except so little as would defray the charge of their taking themselves away into foreign countries. Many years elapsed before the hope of again induced any of their race to return to English, talk about the expulsion, where they had been treated so heartlessly and had suffered so much. This is quite a complimentary and sympathetic portrayal of the Jews in a very different type of work. But the complimentary, perhaps absurdly complimentary, a portrayal of Jews in Dickens is reserved for his final major work, which is Our Mutual Friend. Now, Our Mutual Friend, which is actually in 64, 65, this is written towards the end of Dickens' life. We come across a character who who is in the employ of a person called Fascination Fledgeby. And he portrays Dickens here. Jews, when Fledgeby says, but who have ever heard of a poor Jew? He begins to repeat what is a fairly standard anti-Semitic trait. The Jews are all rich. But then he responds, the Jews, said the old man, raising his eyes from the ground with his former smile, they hear of poor Jews often, and they are very good to them. And this introduces a character called Rhea, or Rhea, I don't know how it's supposed to be said, it's spelled R-I-A-H. And of course, this name, Rhea, in Hebrew means a friend. He's the good guy. He's the nice man. And there are various references here. If you look here, it looks so bad, Jenny, the final paragraph on page 13, responded the old man with gravity. Of course, Our Mutual Friend's a very long book. I have to admit, Tony, I haven't got halfway through it. Perhaps it's time to give it another go. But I will straightway tell you what an impression it wrought upon me. I was hateful in my own eyes. I was hateful to myself, and being so hateful to the debtor and to you. But more than that, and worse than that, to pass out far and broad beyond myself. I reflected that evening, sitting alone in my garden on the housetop, that I was doing dishonour to my ancient faith and race. I clearly reflected for the first time, that in bending my neck to the yoke I was willing to bear, I bent the unwilling necks of the whole Jewish people, for it is not in Christian countries with the Jews as with other peoples. Men say this is a bad Greek, but there are good Greeks. This is a bad Turk, but there are good Turks. Not so with the Jews. Men find the bad among us easily enough. This is Rhea speaking. Among what peoples are the bad not easily found? but they take the worst of us as samples of the best. They take the lowest of us as presentations of the highest. And they say, well, Jews are alike. It's doing what I was content to do here because I was grateful for the past and have small need of money now. I've been a Christian. I could have done it. Compromising no one but my individual self, but doing as a Jew. I could not choose but compromise the Jews of all conditions and all countries. It is a little hard upon us, but it is the truth. This is extraordinary. An extraordinary sympathetic portrayal, an explicit recognition of the way that Jews are mistreated, judged, where individual wrongdoings are extrapolated to, if you like, a national behavior pattern, all the things that we see. And there's a remarkable development from the uncomplimentary early portrayals, which appear to be very much in line with the circumstantial, societal, contextual anti-Semitism that one sees at the time, and not a million miles from the early portrayals in Dostoevsky's writings, to what we get to here, where he writes with great sympathy to the fate of the Jews in the medieval period before the expulsion in A Child's History of England. And this extraordinary portrayal of this guy, Rear, who's the good guy, is mistreated and is defended in the book against anti-Semitic tropes. And of course, what it appears to me here is that what Dickens has been doing, what Dickens is doing here in this last paragraph that began, It Looks So Bad, Jenny, is he seems to be trying to repair what he himself had been doing in his previous writings, and certainly in Oliver Twist. But there is a backstory. In the same way that we saw Dostoevsky had an influence or a set of influences, so did Dickens. And here we're going to see now a number of works and some correspondence. So in a paper called From Fagin to Rhea, How Charles Dickens Looked at Jews, someone called Herb Moskowitz, whom I would guess is probably Jewish. In 1860, Dickens decided to sell his London home, Tavistock House. A Jewish banker and his wife, James and Eliza Davis, were interested in buying it. Dickens wrote to his friend, if the Jew moneylender, I say if, because of course I should never believe in him until he has paid the money, buys, is he going to buy? But within a few days, the money was indeed paid, and Dickens wrote to the other friend, Tavistock House is cleared today, and possession delivered up to the new tenant. I must say that in all things the purchase behaved thoroughly well, and I cannot call to mind any occasion when I've had money dealings with anyone but that has not been so satisfactory considered and trusting. Dickens remained friendly with the Davises, and 3 years later, Mrs. Davis wrote to him and asked if he would contribute to a fund to endow a convalescent home for the Jewish poor. In the letter, she also commented, and I pause there in the middle of the article, because in 1863, Eliza Davis, who is married to James Davis, they are wealthy societal Jews, and Ben Nathan very kindly told me, which I hadn't known, that she is buried in Wilson Cemetery, and I'm sure that when we get a chance to do one of Ben's famous Wilson Cemetery tours, we can go and visit her grave. That she writes to him in 1863. She's now been living in Dickens' former home for the last 3 years, and she writes to him. And here is a selection from the correspondence, some excerpts between Charles Dickens and Eliza Davis. So she asks him for a donation. She starts by saying, here's a convalescent home for the Jewish poor, and maybe Mr. Dickens would like to make a contribution. It has been said that Charles Dickens, the large-hearted, whose works plead so eloquently and so nobly for the oppressed of his country, has encouraged a vile prejudice against the despised Hebrew. She went on to gently remind him that he was unjust to the Jewish people by having Fagin represent them in Oliver Twist. Fagin, I fear, admits only of one interpretation, but while Charles Dickens lives, the author can justify himself or atone for a great wrong. And she demands that he retracts his portrayal of Fagin, and demands that he recants his attitude to Jews, because while he lives as a famous author, and this is his portrayal, he is he's creating a great wrong and harming the Jewish community. So Dickens initially is a bit resistant. He's a bit resistant to this message. I must take leave to say that if there be any general feeling on the part of the intelligent Jewish people that I have done them what you describe as a great wrong, they are far less sensible, far less just, and far less good-tempered people than I've always opposed them to be. So basically, you're being too sensitive, Jews. Fagin in Oliver Twist is a Jew because it was unfortunately was true at the time, to which the story refers, that this class of criminal almost invariably was a Jew, and that may well have been true. But surely no sensible man or woman of your persuasion can fail to observe, firstly, that all the rest of the weak dramatis personae are Christians, This wasn't quite true. This is interpolated by Herb, what's his name? Herb Moskowitz. And secondly, that he is called a Jew, not because of his religion, but because of his race. So he says, well, Jews are a race. I'm not being anti-Semitic. He's a racial Jew. If I were to write a story in which I described a Frenchman or a Spaniard as the Roman Catholic, I should do a very indecent and unjustifiable thing. But I make mention of Fagin as a Jew because he's one of the Jewish people, and because it conveys that kind of idea of him, which I should give my readers of a Chinaman by calling him Chinese. I always speak well of them, the Jewish people, whether in public or in private, although it didn't seem that his initial correspondence about James Davis reflects that, and bear my testimony as I ought to do, to their perfect good faith in transactions as I have ever had with them. She writes back, she's not having it. It is the fact that the Jewish race and religion are inseparable. If a Jew embraces any other faith, he is no longer known as of the race, either to his own people or to the Gentiles to whom he has joined himself. If, as you remark, all must observe that the other criminals were Christians, they are at least contrasted with characters of good Christians. This poor wretched Fagin stands alone, the Jew. How grateful we are to Sir Walter Scott and to Mrs. C.S. Hall for their delineations of some of our race. Yet Isaac of York was not all virtue. I hazard the opinion that it would well repay an author of reputation to examine more closely into the manners and character of the British Jews and to represent them as they really are. And she writes again, we dwell in this country very little known, our domestic customs entirely unknown. I have myself been greatly astonished at the ignorance of my countrymen concerning what they appear to think an entirely foreign people. Look at the blood accusations from time to time rising up against us, even such popular papers, chambers disseminating that calumny. Dickens, I have received your letter with great pleasure, and I hope to be, as I've always been in my heart, the best of friends to the Jewish people. The error you point out to me, apparently the pronunciation is divine. Nay, this is another letter, had occurred to me, as most errors do most people, and it was too late to correct. This is much later on in the correspondence, but it will do no harm. The peculiarities addressed the manner are fixed together for the sake of picturesque, because we don't have the previous correspondence. Later on, Eliza Davis becomes satisfied that Dickens has recanted and has understood her point, and she sends him a gift of a Bible in which she inscribes, presented to Charles Dickens, Esquire, in grateful and admiring recognition of his having exercised the noblest quality man can possess, that of atoning for an injury as soon as conscious of having inflicted it by a Jewess. Quite remarkable. And Dickens, in his response, the terms in which you send me that mark of your remembrance are more gratifying than I can possibly express to you, for they assure me that there is nothing but goodwill left between me and the people for whom I have a real regard, and to whom I would not willfully have given an offence or done an injustice for any worldly consideration. Dickens seems to have changed, and the catalyst for change is this extraordinary woman, Eliza Davis, who takes him on. Now, she obviously had some periphery contact with him, had a fleeting contact with him because they purchased the Dickens' house. But nonetheless, it's quite extraordinary. And she seems to have pretty much single-handedly steered Dickens in a different direction. And all the things we're going to see now will demonstrate and refer much in the same way that Dickens, his contact and subsequent correspondence with Eliza Davis recalibrated his attitude to Jews and the way he chose to portray them. And the reason why the second half of Oliver Twist is more complimentary to Jews and refers to Fagin much more by name rather than the Jew. And the reason we have Rhea, or Rhea, I don't know how it's supposed to be said, but the way in Hebrew is Rhea, is these are all a consequence. This is all the way in which he repaired his relationship with the Jews, perhaps having been an unwitting anti-Semite, or maybe had recanted his former views. And there are a number of articles and books about this, which we'll look at briefly. First, we have an article by someone called Israel Solomons, and he validates that, she went back to him and said, I'm sorry, it's not quite right. Your claim that the Jew is just being portrayed in a certain way is not right, because there are contrasting characters who are Christians, but there are not contrasting Jews. Perhaps we are oversensitive, but are we not ever flayed? When the Jew Rhea was introduced in number 7 of Our Mutual Friend, remembering that they were published in numbers in pamphlets, Mrs. Davis again read to Dickens. Her letter bears the date November the 13th, 1864. She expresses her admiration of the author for his obvious desire to show a higher Jewish type than Fagin. Mrs. Davis makes some comments on details of Dickens' treatment of Rhea. It is indeed hard to understand how the novelist could have made some of the slips he did. That refers us back to before there were certain inaccuracies. Greer was no more a perfect picture from life than Fagin was, but Dickens took Mrs. Davis's criticism in good part, meaning he took her seriously, and she appears to have been the formative influence in his new attitude to Jews. Here we have an article by Lane called Dickens Archetypal Jew, which I'm not going to read in full. Time is marching on, but he describes the first of Dickens' great villain is a Jew, and in making Fagin a Jew, Dickens drawn a tradition of villainy that had been in English literature from the very beginning. So he's fitting in and continuing a tradition. However, while they may have had some basis in reality, there were fictional characters, perhaps exaggerated characters. And he makes reference here to the correspondence with Eliza Davis. And he says that Rhea may have emerged from Dickens' observation of certain Jewish districts, but there seems to be a restatement of his position, as is evident just from reading the literature. Here, a piece from Harry Stone, Dickens and the Jews. The anti-Semitism may be peripheral. It's not a book about anti-Semitism. It's not, as Dostoevsky writes, articles decrying and defaming the Jews. And they are, he suggests, usually embedded in the context which is free from prejudice and intent. However, whatever the intent, Eliza Davis's point is well made. He causes the Jews, someone of his great fame, causes the Jews a great wrong by so doing, and so on. Moving on to here, there's a lengthy piece by someone called Murray Baumgarten. It does appear that Jews rather than non-Jews are interested in this subject. An interesting article which I've read called The Other Woman by Eliza Davis and Charles Dickens. It's about his relationship and the correspondence. He evaluates the correspondence. And if you look in the penultimate paragraph on page 16, Eliza Davis's intervention, apparently led Dickens, who was planning out and writing Our Mutual Friend at that time, meaning the book wasn't written to respond to Eliza Davis, but the character and the way the character portrays it introduced, he suggests, in response to their correspondence, to invent Rhea as a benevolent Jew, beginning with the 7th monthly number. Throughout the novel, Rhea plays a key role as a benefactor of Jenny Wren and Lizzie Hexam. This has often been noted and remarked upon. Making amends, Rhea is intended to redeem the figure of Fagin, the Jew devil of Oliver Twist. Yet in Our Mutual Friend, Rhea has a constrained position, first being taken by the other character in the novel to be the blood-sucking usurer. So you can see that he is contrast. You see, I think that what Dickens does is that he said, this is the way Jews are viewed, blood-sucking, money-grabbing, and Rhea comes to refute that position, which is the position you are supposed to leave the book with. Eliza Davis accepted Dickens' apology. After Dickens' death and the publication of the correspondence between them, the Observer and the Daily News, maybe Dickens wrote a very kind letter. Eliza Davis responds, I can't say how pleased at the cordial good feeling expressed by yourself and your family, etc., which means there was a sense that this matter had been resolved by the end of Dickens' life. And maybe Dickens is the author's daughter, and there's a little more there which appears at the top of the page. Now, in the last excerpt, another article I found by someone called Susan Mayer, Anti-Semitism and Social Critique in Dickens' Oliver Twist. Again, referring to this correspondence, now quite celebrated, could have been published between Eliza Davis and Charles Dickens. Dickens was apparently surprised by the charge. He wrote back to Mrs. Davis to contest it, and throughout an exchange of several letters, Dickens never admitted that his representation of Fagin could reasonably be seen as in any way inimical to Jews. Yet in the following year, he introduced the character of a kindly Jew in Our Mutual Friend. And for the 1867 edition of Oliver Twist, he made some careful revisions of the novel, editing out many instances in which he had substituted the words the Jew for Fagin's name, and in the process, indubitably lessening the heaviness of the novel's anti-Semitism. Dickens's implicit response to Mrs. Davis's criticism was impressive and praiseworthy, but he was so easily convinced to suggest, despite his denials, that he already had some sense of his own injustice in the portrayal of Jews through Fagin and Oliver Twist. I think this point is important. Dostoevsky is an existential anti-Semite who starts perhaps in the societal context and then is more than happy moving to become a vile, hating conspiracy theorist, viewing Jews as sucking the blood of Europe and Christ killers. Whereas it appears that Dickens is a contextual anti-Semite in his literature, but perhaps has some conscience about it, realizes it may be wrong, and uses his relationship with Eliza Davis to perhaps surface something for him, which may have been there already. It does seem that he gives in rather quickly, and I think this analysis bears some serious consideration, that he'd perhaps already come to this realization, had developed in some way, or perhaps had always sensed it, but hadn't allowed it to come through, because he already had some sense of his own injustice in the portrayal of Jews through Fagin and Oliver Twist. But she goes on to say, nonetheless, yet what Dickens did was only partial. He lessened the frequency with which the term the Jew is used for Fagin, especially the chapter recounting Fagin's condemnation to death. However, that's very nice, but we do know that he goes on to write a very sympathetic piece in the Child's History of England, and write an extremely sympathetic and positive, perhaps almost incredibly so, character later on, although of course Susan Mayer's article is only about Oliver Twist. And this change over a period of some 16 years is emphasized by two excerpts from the Jewish Chronicle, with which we will finish before I wrap up. In 1854, the Jewish Chronicle published a critique in which they referred to Dickens and his writings. Why Jews alone should be excluded from the sympathizing heart of this great author and powerful friend of the oppressed. It's in the context of a longer sentence. So they say that he is critical of Jews. His sympathetic approach to others does not seem to extend to the Jews. He seems to portray himself as a powerful friend of the oppressed. The rehabilitation of the oppressed is a constant theme in the literature of Dickens and of Dostoevsky, for that matter. And yet the Jews are excluded. That's how the Jewish Chronicle's editorial sees it in 1854. And when Dickens dies in 1870, June 1870, an obituary piece or an opinion piece appears in the Jewish Chronicle. We do not know all that we have lost. So long as journalism exists, so long as literature is valued, so long as humanity is estimated, so long, we think, will Charles Dickens be mourned. And surely the Jewish journal, some recognition of grateful memory, is due to the generous spirit of the writer, who in the very early days of his life and his writings, he touched the Jewish character in a somewhat rough and undeserved severity in the unreal character of Fagin, made ample amends in his later, wiser, more chastened days. So I think that's kind of captures it very well. The Jewish Chronicle notices the transition and his development, but gives him a very, very favourable send-off. Now, there is a well-known phrase in rabbinic literature, Achrei Mos Kadoshim Emoy, citing the sequence of Parshias in the Seder Vayikra, after death, Kadoshim of the Holy One, and then you talk about them, which means it's very easy to talk favourably of people who are no longer around. But nonetheless, I think we can identify the sentence in the Jewish Chronicle through the development we've seen in Dickens' writings. And so I think this is a relatively superficial study. I don't consider myself an expert in literature, and certainly not in Dickens, maybe very slightly more so than Dostoevsky, but no. Nonetheless, I think our research has demonstrated that there is a trajectory. They start in not dissimilar places, where they articulate familiar, well-trodden anti-Semitic tropes, Jews in terms of their appearance, in terms of their occupations, in terms of their interest in money, and so on. And yet, would appear under different influences, go in completely different directions, careers which are almost overlap, they're not quite, but they are contemporaries for a number of their years. But we see that Dostoevsky, whether it's an innate extremism, an innate fanatical Orthodox Christianity, which is surfaces through his growing relationship and rehabilitation subsequent to his imprisonment, his relationship with Pobedonostsev and the nobles at court, who are really the architects of all the extreme hatred, the pogroms, the anti-Jewish legislation, which led many of our ancestors to flee to Western Europe and to the United States. And gradually, under those influences, he goes down into this dark tunnel, this cul-de-sac of extremism, hatred, and a sense that the Jews are controlling and running the world, which becomes more and more extreme, and is becoming ever more extreme at the end of his life in the early 1880s. In contrast, Dickens appears to have not been an existential anti-Semite, but more a contextual one. Perhaps he's even aware that he's writing something which isn't quite right and may feel slightly guilty about it. But nonetheless, the heroine, the hero of the piece is someone called Eliza Davis, who has the temerity, the guts to write to Dickens, to call him out on what he's done. And to be fair to Dickens, Dickens does resist a little, but you can see from his response, from his rewriting of parts of Oliver Twist, from his history of a child of England, and particularly from his portrayal of this rather unbelievable Rhea character in his final great novel, Our Mutual Friend, that in great contrast, he moves in a positive trajectory. He moves towards a more favourable approach to Jews, a recognition that perhaps he had been mistaken. And in this regard, he's almost seems a paradigm of teshuvah, in that, you know, the Jewish Chronicle holds him up as a paradigm in his death of having reconsidered his position. So we see two of the greatest, Dickens, perhaps the greatest English writer of his time, Dostoevsky, perhaps the greatest Russian writer of his time, starting in similar places with similar traits, but going in very different directions under very different influences. I'm going to stop the screen share, and thank you very much for participating. I'll turn the mute off. You are welcome. I'm not sure I'm capable of, first of all, because I'm near the end of a very long and very demanding fast, and also capable because I'm not sure I actually know anything more about it. I'll answer any questions, but we can try, have a few minutes discussion. My intent is to give us 5 minutes more, and then bring things to an end for the evening. So I've you now are welcome to unmute if you wish. There's now an echo. I'm not quite sure why there's an echo. But if you would like to comment or ask questions, I'm afraid I had to put people back in mute. Something was causing an echo, making it impossible to hear. If you would like to ask a question, then please unmute yourself selectively. Right.
Hello. I was going to ask, but then you sort of answered it. That when you said that,
it's Trevi Dane to ask it.
Well, about that when the influence of Davis changed his view on Jews, and then you mentioned also that it later affected the later parts of Oliver Twist, which was I was a bit surprised at that, because that was written so much earlier. But then it said that it was a later edition.
Yes, it seems to be a later edition, but all the other writers do say that he seems to have, even in the second half of the original, moderated the way in which there are less references to Jew, more to Fagin. I think that it appears that the second half has a more favourable approach, but then he also rewrote certain sections. I'm afraid that we are well out of my skill set. And so I'm reliant on what other people say. I could have read Oliver Twist 5 times and probably not noticed this. So the source just before the Jewish Chronicle, Trevor, at the end, I think was probably quite helpful in passing that.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. If you're speaking and you're on mute, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Esther, are you speaking?
Yes, I am. Hi. Thank you very much. Very interesting and so illuminating to compare, in a way, quite broadly, Russian attitudes in the 1850s and 60s with British ones. What I think is most remarkable is that this woman, Eliza Davis, is still lost to history. We've got this amazing correspondence, and we're obviously interpreting as much as we can into it. She did seem to change Dickens's mind, but who on earth was she? And how could a woman just emerge from somewhere, almost nowhere, while in Russia, Dostoevsky was in a circle of intellectuals and in many ways really divorced from practical everyday life. And he could philosophize as much as he liked. And that's probably why he came into the circle of influence of all of those intellectuals in Vremya, the Time journal that you mentioned. And I think the coda to the story is that I suppose Britain was seen at that time as a place of perhaps greater tolerance, and things were getting easier for Jews in Britain, while, as we know, they got worse and worse and worse for Jews in Russia. So,
very interesting. Hester, would you like to identify yourself?
Well, I'm Hester. I am the project leader of the Willesden Cemetery Heritage Project, the House of Life. And I discovered Eliza Davis was buried at Willesden, and her grave is there for you to visit. She's actually buried on the main path opposite the Rothschilds. And I think her family was not an insignificant family, but again, we don't really know very much about it. I think she was born in Jamaica, where Jews were involved in the sugar trade, and obviously she was married to a banker. So we are looking at the stories of women in Willesden, and we really want to bring them. She's featured in the new interpretation in the lodge. She's not on our website, but you can come and visit from September. Thank you very much for allowing me to give a plug.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think with that, I'm going to bring the evening to a close. Thank you very much for joining me and allowing me to kind of air something that I've become rather interested in recently. I'm delighted that so many at the end of the long fast have felt this is a good way to spend an hour. I hope fast safely for the remaining. I think if you're in London, it's another 36 minutes, 34 minutes, something like that, 40 minutes or so. And I wish you in advance a good Shabbos.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a really interesting lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, very welcome.